All right, ever think about what America might look like if, climate change just kept getting worse and worse?
Not a very pretty picture, I'd imagine.
No, not at all. What if we had another civil war too? Like imagine that. And this time it's all about energy.
That's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, it is. And that's the world Omar Akkad creates in his book American War. Have you heard of it?
Oh yeah, I've heard of American War. It's supposed to be really intense.
Intense is putting it mildly. It's like he took all our anxieties about the future, climate change, political divisions, you name it, and just turned them up to 11.
So it's a dystopian novel then, like a cautionary tale.
Yeah, you could say that. But it's also so much more. Ellicott is a phenomenal writer. He doesn't just throw out these big ideas. He really digs deep into the human impact of it all. How these events would affect real people.
I can see why this would be a popular book for a deep dive then. It sounds like there's a lot to unpack there.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Right.
We've got excerpts from the audiobook, interviews with Ellicott himself, the whole 9 yards. We're going to break down the big themes, the characters, the historical parallels, you name it.
Sounds like a plan. So where do we start? Do you want to give us a little background on the book's premise? Like what's the setting?
Okay, so picture this. It's 2074, decades from now. The world's a very different place. Sea levels have risen dramatically. I mean, think about it. Major cities are underwater.
Wow, like no more Miami Beach.
Gone. And it's not just the landscape that's changed. The U.S. is deeply divided, more so than ever before. The federal government has passed this law, the Sustainable Future Act. It basically bans fossil fuels.
Whoa, a complete ban on fossil fuels? That's a bold move.
You said it. And predictably, it doesn't go over well with everyone. The South, still heavily reliant on oil and gas, they see this as a direct attack on their way of life.
I bet. Talk about a culture clash. So this is where the Second Civil War comes in.
Exactly. The tension builds and builds, and then boom, the first shots are fired at Fort Jackson, of all places. We actually have a clip from the audiobook. Let's listen.
Oh, wow, that's chilling.
I know, right? The way El Akkad describes the chaos, the fear, the sudden eruption of violence, it's just so visceral. It really makes you think how fragile peace can be.
No kidding. And how easily things can spiral out of control. So in this chaotic world, who is the main character we follow?
Well, that would be Surratt Chestnut. When the war breaks out, she's just a little girl, 6 years old, living in Louisiana.
Oh, wow, 6 years old during a civil war. That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, to talk about a rough childhood. We see the war unfold through her eyes, so we experience the horrors, the confusion, the displacement, all of it from a child's perspective.
I can see how that would make the story even more impactful, more emotionally resonant.
Absolutely. Surratt's journey is really the heart and soul of American War. We watch her grow up in this war-torn world, and we see how it shapes her, changes her. She goes through a lot, to say the least.
It sounds like she's a pretty complex character. Does she end up becoming a soldier herself?
Well, I don't want to spoil too much, but let's just say the war has a profound impact on her. It shapes her choices, her beliefs, her entire worldview.
That makes sense. You can't go through something like that and come out unscathed.
Speaking of shaping worldviews, there's this character, Albert Gaines, right? I've heard he plays a pretty significant role in Surratt's life.
Oh, Gaines is a fascinating character, definitely a key player. He becomes kind of a mentor figure to Surratt, but he's also, well, he's got his own agenda.
Oh, I bet he does. What's his deal?
He's very charismatic, but also manipulative. He's obsessed with the Old South, and he uses these stories, these narratives, to fuel Surratt's anger, to turn her against the North.
So he's kind of like a propaganda machine, using history to manipulate people's emotions.
Exactly. And he's very good at it. He preys on Surratt's vulnerability, gives her a sense of purpose, of belonging, even if it's built on a foundation of lies. That's scary. It shows how easily someone can be swayed, especially when they're looking for answers for someone to guide them.
It really does. And it makes you think about the power of narratives, how they can be used to shape people's beliefs, to justify violence, to win wars.
It's a timeless tactic, unfortunately, but I thought this war was just between the North and the South. Is there an international component as well?
Oh yeah, it gets even more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Enter the Bouazizi Empire.
The Bouazizi Empire. Who are they?
This is where El Akkad's world building gets really interesting. The Bouazizi Empire is basically a federation of Arab countries. They've risen to become the new global superpower.
So it's like a shift in the global order, a new world power emerging.
Exactly. And while they don't directly get involved in the American War, they're definitely pulling strings behind the scenes.
So America's become a pawn in their game.
Pretty much. They're playing both sides, manipulating the conflict to further their own interests.
That adds a whole new layer of complexity. So what happens to Sarat and her family in all of this? Where do they end up?
Well, they're forced to flee their home, like so many others. They end up in a refugee camp called Camp Patience. It's meant for displaced Southerners.
Camp Patience. That name sounds almost ironic in the context of a war.
Yeah, there's definitely a dark irony there. And the camp itself is a direct reference to a real-world tragedy, the Sabra and Shatila massacre.
Oh, wow, that's heavy. I'm not familiar with that event.
It was a horrific massacre that took place during the Lebanese Civil War. Thousands of Palestinian refugees were killed.
Oh, wow, that's terrible. So Akkad is drawing a parallel between this real-world event and the fictional Camp Patience.
Absolutely. And it's not just a passing reference. The massacre at Camp Patience is a pivotal moment in the book, a turning point for Sarat. It hardens her, fills her with rage and a thirst for revenge.
I can see how that would be a traumatic experience, one that would change her forever. Using that historical parallel, that's a powerful way to drive home the brutality of war, the human cost.
Exactly. Ellicott isn't afraid to show the ugliness, the senselessness of it all, and he does it in a way that's both thought-provoking and deeply disturbing. But it's not just about the violence, you know. Ellicott also uses language in such an interesting way.
What do you mean?
Well, throughout the book, he weaves in these fictionalized versions of real-world speeches and documents. It's like he's reframing history, showing us familiar events from a completely different perspective.
That's a fascinating concept. Can you give me an example?
For example, he takes President Obama's Cairo speech and reimagines it, delivered by the leader of the Bouazizi Empire. It's jarring, to say the least.
I bet. What's the point of doing that?
I think he's trying to challenge our assumptions, make us question the narratives we've been told, whose voice gets heard, whose story gets told, and how does that shape our understanding of history.
That's such a clever way to make us think critically about how history is presented and how easily it can be manipulated. It makes you wonder, what other stories are out there that we haven't heard?
Exactly. And that's just one example. He does this throughout the book with all sorts of documents and speeches. It's a really effective way to make you question everything you thought you knew.
Ellicott sounds like a very deliberate writer, very intentional in his choices. I'm really intrigued by this book now.
I knew you would be.
So, what else can you tell me? I'm ready to dive deeper.
Well, hold on tight because this is where things get really interesting.
It's almost like he's holding up a mirror, right? Making us see how easily we can fall prey to those same manipulative tactics.
Yeah, it's definitely a wake-up call. And, it's not just about the big political narratives. It's also about the personal ones. Think about Surratt and Albert Gaines.
Right, right. He basically grooms her, doesn't he? Using those stories to mold her into this weapon for the Southern cause.
It's messed up, isn't it?
Yeah.
He takes advantage of her at such a vulnerable time in her life after she's lost everything, and he fills her head with this warped version of history.
And she clings to it, doesn't she? Because it gives her something to believe in, something to fight for.
Yeah, it's tragic. It makes you wonder how much control any of us really have over our own destinies.
That's a big question. I mean, Surratt's life is so clearly shaped by forces beyond her control. The war, the displacement, the manipulation. It makes you think, are we all just products of our circumstances?
I think Ellicott is definitely wrestling with that question in the book. And, it's not just Surratt. A lot of the characters in American War feel like they're being swept along by events, like they're powerless to resist.
I can see how that would be a major theme, especially in a story about war. I mean, war is inherently chaotic and unpredictable, right? Individuals get caught up in these larger forces, these systems of power that they have no control over.
Exactly. But even within that chaos, Ellicott still shows us moments of choice. Moments where characters have to decide what they're willing to fight for, what lines they're willing to cross.
Right. Like even if you're caught in a current, you can still try to steer yourself, right?
Right.
You can't necessarily change the direction of the flow, but you can make choices about how you navigate it.
That's a great analogy. And I think that's what makes Surratt such a compelling character. She's dealt this terrible hand, but she still makes choices, even if those choices are driven by anger, by trauma.
So what kind of choices does she make? I mean, I know you don't want to give away any spoilers, but...
Well, let's just say she ends up in a very dark place.
Mhm.
She ends up at Sugarloaf.
Sugarloaf? What's that?
It's a detention camp. Think Guantanamo Bay, but even more brutal.
Oh, wow. So basically a black site where they hold suspected terrorists and enemies of the state.
Pretty much. And Ellicott's descriptions of Sugarloaf are just chilling. He captures the dehumanization, the psychological torture, the sense of utter hopelessness.
Ugh, it sounds awful. Is this where he uses those real-world documents you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, he includes these excerpts from these fictional Sugarloaf detainee letters. They're heavily redacted, all bureaucratic jargon, and they're just heartbreaking. You can feel the prisoners' desperation, their attempts to hold on to their humanity in this system that's designed to strip it away.
It's like the language itself becomes a weapon, a way to control and silence people.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder of how easily language can be used to dehumanize, to justify oppression. And, what's even more chilling is what's not said in those letters, the stories that are censored, the voices that are silenced.
Right. It makes you wonder how much of the truth we're never told, how much is hidden from us.
And I think that's a big part of what Ellicott is trying to do with American War. He wants us to be skeptical of official narratives, to question the stories we're told, to look for the gaps, the silences.
So it's not just about war, it's about the stories we tell about war.
Yeah, and how those stories shape our understanding of the world, how they can be used to justify violence, to create divisions, to perpetuate cycles of hatred and revenge.
I mean, think about it. Both sides in the American Civil War had their own narratives, their own justifications for fighting. And those narratives continue to shape how we understand that conflict even today, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes American War so relevant, so thought-provoking. It's not just a story about a fictional war. It's a commentary on the nature of conflict itself, on how easily we can fall into those same traps of us versus them thinking.
I remember you mentioned a line about fighting a war with guns and fighting peace with stories.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorite lines from the book. You fight the war with guns, you fight the peace with stories.
It's such a powerful statement about the enduring power of narratives, how they can shape not only the course of conflict, but also its aftermath.
It's like even after the fighting stops, the battle for hearts and minds continues. And the stories we tell ourselves about the past, about the enemy, they play a huge role in determining whether we can achieve a lasting peace.
And, that line really resonates with me in our current world. I mean, think about the way social media is used to spread propaganda, to manipulate people, to create these echo chambers where everyone's just reinforcing their own biases.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's scary how easily information or misinformation can spread these days. It's like we're all living in our own little filter bubbles, and it's getting harder and harder to have meaningful conversations across those divides.
And that's why I think books like American War are so important. They force us to step outside our comfort zones, to confront different perspectives, to think critically about the narratives we're being fed.
It's like a challenge, isn't it, to look beyond the surface, to question everything we think we know.
Exactly. And that's not always comfortable, but it's necessary. If we want to create a more peaceful and just world, we have to be willing to engage with those difficult conversations. So what do you think? Are you ready to talk about the ending of American War?
Oh, is that where we are already? I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this book.
I know, right? There's just so much to unpack, but yeah, the ending is something else. It's definitely not your typical happy ending.
Okay, well, no spoilers, but what kind of feeling does it leave you with?
Unease. A lot of unease. And a lot of questions.
Sounds about right for a book like this.
It is. It's one of those books that stays with you long after you finish it. It makes you think about the world differently.
And that's a good thing, right? I mean, isn't that what we want from art? To challenge us, to make us see things from a new perspective.
Absolutely. And American War definitely does that.
Yeah.
And it's not like, sunshine and roses type of hope. It's more like, okay, wow, things are really messed up, but maybe, just maybe, we can learn from this and do better.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the potential for change, even in the darkest of times. And, one thing that struck me about the ending is that it's not really an ending, is it? It feels more like a beginning.
I see what you mean. It's like Ellicott is leaving it up to us, the readers, to decide what happens next, to imagine what kind of future we want to create.
Right. He's given us all this information, all these different perspectives, and now it's our turn to take that and make something of it.
And I think that's what makes American War such a powerful and thought-provoking book. It doesn't give us easy answers. It doesn't tell us what to think. It just presents us with this incredibly complex and challenging world and says, okay, what are you going to do about it?
It's a call to action, in a way, a call to engage with the world around us more critically, to question the narratives we're being told, and to fight for the kind of future we want to see.
And, it's not just about big political issues either. It's about the choices we make in our own lives, the way we treat each other, the stories we tell ourselves.
Right. It's about recognizing our own complicity in the systems that perpetuate violence and injustice. And it's about taking responsibility for our actions, for the impact we have on the world.
A lot to take in, I know.
Yeah.
But it's important. And I think it's something we all need to be thinking about, especially in the world we live in today.
I completely agree. So, if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, this book sounds intense, but also maybe a little too real right now, what would you say to them?
I'd say, don't be afraid to dive in. American War is a challenging read, yes, but it's also an incredibly rewarding one. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish it. And who knows, maybe it'll even change the way you see the world.
I think it definitely has the potential to do that. It's one of those books that makes you think, what if? And those what if questions, they can be really powerful. They can spark conversations, inspire action, and maybe even help us create a better future.
So if you're looking for a book that will challenge you, that will make you think, that will make you feel, and maybe even keep you up at night, then American War is definitely worth checking out.
And if you're looking for more deep dives into thought-provoking books and ideas, well, you know where to find us.
That's right. Subscribe to The Deep Dive for more conversations like this. We'll be back next week with a new book and a whole new set of questions to explore. Until then, keep reading, keep thinking, and keep the conversation going.